20, A Maniac. As Petra brushed her teeth that night, she went over what had happened in Delia Dell Hall. There had been a clear zap in her mind. It reminded her of the time she'd been plugging a frayed lamp cord into the wall and her finger had landed on the bare wire. Had Mrs. Sharp let something slip? Was she hoping they'd pick up on her clues? Petra thought of what Ms. Hussey had once said about criminals wanting to be discovered. If Mrs. Sharp and Ms. Hussey had been collaborating, and then, as if someone had changed the prescription on her glasses, she suddenly saw how wild her ideas had gotten. Were she and Calder crazy to think those two women could be mixed up in the theft? Their suspicions about their neighbor and their teacher suddenly seemed overwrought and childish. How could this staircase experience be anything but a huge, strange coincidence? First of all, she and Calder and Mrs. Sharp had been playing a game with pentominoes. Mrs. Sharp obviously had never seen a pentomino before. The words she had made up that afternoon were not something she had planned. Second, she was an old lady. She was the widow of a murder victim. She had gotten a letter from the thief. After weeks of worrying, she had turned it in. She had asked for police protection, and Ms. Hussey was a young teacher and a dedicated one. Why would she ever get mixed up in a major art theft? Petra tapped her toothbrush on the sink in a businesslike way. Her imagination had run away with her in Delia Dell. Hoping to get the mystery solved, she had jumped to some ridiculous conclusions. All this looking was making her crazy. The zap was probably from not feeling well, and Mrs. Sharp's pentomino words were nothing more than a magnificent Charles Fort incident. The stolen painting was probably in Switzerland or Brazil or Japan. She'd apologized to Calder in the morning for scaring him. In 2 days, it would be her 12th birthday. 12-year-olds were old enough to sort out what made sense and what didn't. Petra put down her toothbrush and, sitting on the edge of the bathtub, waited for the water to get hot. She suddenly thought about the lady. Am I thinking clearly? She wanted to ask her. Did I just imagine what happened today? Are you in Delia Dell? She waited for a response. There wasn't one. Doubt seeped back into her mind. Since when had she been so rational? Imagining. That was what she was best at. And hadn't she and Calder agreed that they needed to rescue Miss Hussey? And how about that letter she had just found in Mrs. Sharp's bushes? She hopped into the tub and put a hot washcloth on her head. Letting her neck flop backward, she closed her eyes. Suddenly, she found herself picturing a rectangle inside a triangle. It was more a feeling than an image. She dunked her head, letting the water run into her ears. Couldn't she stop thinking? It was a sparkling, whiter than white winter morning. A morning of brusque sky, inky black branches, and the blinding, two-dimensional look of new snow. Glancing out her window as she dressed, Petra thought that the branches could be rivers on a map, or cracks on a blue plate. Maybe they were symbols in an unknown code. How do we know that trees don't talk deliberately with their branches, giving slow, intricate messages with an unnoticed vocabulary of shapes? Calder's thinking was infectious. Whistling happily, Petra flew down the stairs to breakfast. The world felt rich with possibility. Her practical reasoning last night now seemed cowardly, unimaginative. What had gotten into her? She thought of the thief's phrase, I congratulate you all on your pursuit of the truth. It was Saturday morning, and her parents, still in pajamas, their heads almost touching, were absorbed in an article in the Chicago Tribune. They looked upset. The guy is a maniac, a self-absorbed lunatic. Petra's father slammed his hand against the table. All the cereal bowls jumped. What's wrong? Petra froze. More news on that Vermeer painting. We'll all have to pray that the FBI knows what they're doing. Frank Andely stood up as he spoke, putting a hand on his daughter's shoulder. Aren't you glad you aren't responsible for saving one of the world's masterpieces from a maniac? Yeah, Dad. Her heart sinking, she began to read. The National Gallery of Art received the following anonymous letter yesterday. the last communication from the thief, an advertisement sent to the Chicago Tribune, had been mailed from Florence, Italy. The letter received yesterday was mailed from a post office in Washington, D.C. Both the FBI and the National Gallery of Art felt it was important that the public know immediately about the thief's latest intentions. So this was the newspaper article, and then the font changes. So now we know we're reading the text of the letter. Dear National Gallery, the recently released book, The Vermeer Dilemma, What Happens Now, points to the public's overwhelming response to my letter and the 3 advertisements I took out in newspapers around the world. They have, indeed, come to agree with me. Now it is up to you and to your colleagues to agree publicly with us all. I demand that you write letters to all other owners of Vermeer paintings. You are to state that my point of view is a valid one and to request that the attributions that I identified earlier be changed immediately. If these attributions are not changed within 1 month, by January 11th, I will, against my desires, destroy a lady writing. I will consider it a sacrifice in the interest of truth, a lesson for those too rigid, too dishonest to do what is right. I am old and will not live long. I will, however, live to see this resolved on museum walls and in writing, or, to the horror of us all, in ashes. I beg of you to spare a lady writing. If you look into your hearts, I know that you will, as I predicted in November, come to agree with me. Do what is right. Petra dropped the paper and rushed out of the kitchen.